Okay, let's get into it. We're doing a deep dive today, looking at a really complex, fascinating subject. It's based on a YouTube transcript called The Psychology of Hitler.
Right.
And our mission really is to take this source material, pull out the core insights, and look through the psychological lenses it presents, trying to understand the forces that, might have shaped Hitler's mind from childhood right up to becoming dictator.
It's quite a task the source sets out, exploring that psychological landscape.
Yeah.
How does an Austrian boy become, well, one of history's most infamous figures? So the goal today is really to help you get informed on this specific perspective, the one offered in this transcript. Quickly, effectively, focusing on what it highlights.
Absolutely. And this material, it starts right at the beginning, his childhood. Paints a picture of his father, Alois. Very strict, authoritarian. Harsh, demanding. Even physically abusive, according to the source.
Yeah, and what's really striking, based on the source's analysis here, is how developmental psychology might view this. Authoritarian parenting, especially like the kind described, it can sort of cultivate rigid thinking, submission to authority. And interestingly, it can also increase aggression, but directed outwards, towards, perceived others.
Okay.
The transcript suggests this environment could have heavily influenced Hitler's, intense need for control later in life.
Right. Because the father's punishments, the source says, instilled this sense of humiliation,
Yeah.
powerlessness.
Right.
But then you have his mother, Clara, the complete opposite, apparently.
Exactly. Very nurturing, maybe even overly protective, the source implies.
Yeah.
And the argument presented is that these really opposing forces, harshness from the father, maybe deep emotional dependence fostered by the mother, could have planted some pretty significant seeds for later psychological struggles. The idea put forward here is that, people who feel profoundly powerless as kids often try to overcompensate later, seeking dominance, control. And for Hitler, this need for dominance, the source posits, just seemed to intensify over time.
So moving on a bit from those early years, the source talks about his young adult life, a time marked by, failure. Repeatedly.
Yeah.
His rejection from art school is highlighted. That seems like a particularly crushing blow. Shattered his self-worth, it suggests. He struggled financially too, right? Even lived in homeless shelters in Vienna for a time.
That's what the source details, yes. And this phase, as it's analyzed here, brings up the idea of an inferiority complex.
Alfred Adler territory.
Sort of, yeah. The text suggests that when people feel inherently weak or inadequate, they might actively seek power or recognition as a way to compensate. The interpretation offered here is that Hitler might have developed this strong belief in being destined for greatness, specifically as a kind of psychological defense.
A way to avoid facing the failures.
Exactly. A way to avoid processing those feelings of inadequacy.
And it was during this time in Vienna, wasn't it? Grappling with all this struggle, feeling alienated, that he was exposed to anti-Semitic ideology quite heavily.
Yes, and this is where the source brings in social psychology. When people feel alienated, isolated, maybe lacking self-worth, they often look really intensely for a group identity or, a grander cause, something to restore that sense of belonging.
Right.
So for Hitler, this worldview he was developing, fueled by the ideas around him, it provided a convenient scapegoat, dangerously convenient.
Blaming Jews for his own problems and society's problems.
That's the argument. It becomes, in this context, a potent psychological defense mechanism, projecting his frustrations, his failures, onto an external group.
The source also mentions the personal tragedy around then his mother's death, described as maybe the only real source of stability and affection in his life.
And some historians referenced in this material suggest that this loss could have significantly intensified his emotional detachment, fueled his existing resentments, maybe further solidified his embrace of those radical beliefs. It's presented as another layer, adding to the complexity.
Then comes World War I. The source suggests this period dramatically reinforced everything, solidified his worldview.
The trenches, incredibly brutal environment, death almost constant.
And there's one specific event the transcript highlights.
Oh, yeah.
A moment where he apparently left his trench briefly, came back, and his entire unit had been wiped out by a shell.
Wow.
This near-death experience, the source argues, didn't make him fearful. Paradoxically, it strengthened his conviction.
That he was protected, destined for something.
Exactly. That he had this special, grand destiny guiding him.
And there's a psychological concept mentioned related to this in the source, Loser correlation, is that it?
Yeah, loser correlation.
Okay, so it's a way the source frames this idea of people assigning like disproportionate meaning to random chance events, seeing patterns where there aren't any objectively.
So he used this random survival as proof.
That's the interpretation offered, yeah.
Yeah.
Proof of his supposed destiny. The source does acknowledge the trauma, witnessing death, potential PTSD symptoms, but it focuses more on how he interpreted it all.
But for Hitler, the ultimate trauma of the war, according to this source, wasn't even the fighting. It was Germany's defeat.
Exactly, yeah. Instead of seeing it as a military outcome, the source suggests he just latched onto confirmation bias.
Rigidly believing that narrative, the stabbed-in-the-back myth.
Precisely. Believing and promoting that false narrative that Germany wasn't defeated militarily, but betrayed by internal enemies. Jews, Marxists, politicians.
And that's classic confirmation bias, right?
Yeah.
Selectively interpreting information to fit what you already believe.
At a crucial moment, yes. Ignoring contradictory evidence. For him, the source argues, this narrative fit perfectly with those scapegoating tendencies he'd already developed.
Okay, so fast forward. He starts gaining political power. The source notes certain personality traits becoming much more apparent. Some researchers, according to the transcript, suggest his patterns line up significantly with narcissistic personality disorder characteristics.
Yeah, the source describes this manifesting pretty clearly. Overwhelming grandiosity, this relentless need for admiration, and a really striking lack of empathy.
For anyone outside his immediate goals, basically.
Right. The material highlights how his public persona evolved too. His speeches got really theatrical, rhetoric filled with godlike imagery. He increasingly painted himself as Germany's savior, destined.
Those failed assassination attempts over the years, the source suggests they didn't scare him off.
Quite the opposite, apparently. It suggests they only fueled his existing delusions of invincibility, his special status.
This is where the source brings in survivor bias, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. That tendency to misinterpret luck or fortunate outcomes as proof of skill or destiny or inevitability.
While ignoring all the time, similar risks led to failure for others.
Right. So for Hitler, according to this interpretation, surviving those attempts just reinforced this dangerous belief that he was untouchable, chosen.
But crucially, he didn't rise to power just based on his own psychology, did he? The source makes it clear he was a master manipulator of mass psychology.
Oh, absolutely. Leveraging key principles to sway a whole nation. He used scapegoating systematically, but on a national scale now, blaming minorities for economic problems, social anxieties.
Standard playbook, but amplified.
Massively amplified. He brilliantly leveraged group psychology, fostering this powerful sense of national unity, collective purpose, propaganda, rallies, symbols. It was pervasive.
And the source points to obedience to authority, too, referencing things like the Milgram experiments.
Yes, exactly. Those famous studies showing how far people will go following orders from an authority figure, even when it conflicts with their conscience, even when it causes harm. Hitler capitalized on that.
And conformity. The source mentions Solomon Asch's research as well.
Yeah, Asch's studies illustrated how social pressure makes people conform to the majority view, even if it contradicts what they can clearly see.
So the regime created an environment where questioning just felt impossible.
Or incredibly dangerous. The source posits that Hitler and his regime cultivated exactly that environment. These overwhelming forces of obedience and conformity made dissent seem unthinkable for many ordinary citizens.
So as his power became absolute, the source suggests those cognitive distortions we talked about earlier just got more extreme, more entrenched.
Yeah, specifically black and white thinking. Seeing the world in absolute terms. Superior versus inferior, friend versus enemy, no room for nuance.
At all.
He actively dismissed opposing views, material notes, surrounded himself only with sycophants, people who just reinforce his distorted beliefs.
Which sounds like confirmation bias reaching its absolute peak.
Pretty much, yeah. A total rejection of any evidence, any reality that contradicted his worldview.
And when things started going badly for Germany, disastrously wrong.
He didn't adapt, didn't course correct. He just compulsively doubled down on that destructive path.
Then you get to the final days. In the bunker, the source describes him as increasingly erratic, delusional, paranoid.
Yes, and some historians, according to this material, suggest this could have been significantly exacerbated by amphetamine psychosis.
From drug use.
From excessive drug use, yeah. The symptoms fit, apparently. Severe delusions, hallucinations, profound paranoia. The source suggests this might offer a psychological explanation for some of his really bizarre, detached decisions in those final months.
And then, as defeat became unavoidable, undeniable, the source talks about him experiencing what it calls narcissistic collapse.
Right. It's presented as this psychological phenomenon where someone with extreme grandiosity, this inflated self-image, effectively self-destructs when that carefully built facade of power and invincibility is just shattered by reality.
So rather than face humiliation, surrender.
He chose suicide, the source suggests, psychologically unable to confront the reality that his grand vision had totally collapsed.
Wow. So, okay, looking back at everything the source material covers, it's a lot. Potential impacts of childhood, the toll of young adult failures, how he interpreted WWI trauma, those personality traits potentially aligning with narcissism.
His calculated manipulation of group dynamics, the escalating cognitive distortions, potential influence of drugs, and then that final collapse.
Yeah.
It really presents a view where Hitler's path wasn't down to one simple thing.
Not at all. It was a horrifying convergence, according to this perspective. Unresolved childhood issues, leveraging social psychology phenomena like scapegoating, obedience, conformity.
Plus those significant cognitive distortions like confirmation bias, black and white thinking.
And potentially underlying personality issues, maybe substance use effects compounding it all.
So understanding these forces, as laid out in the source, it isn't just about dissecting one historical figure, is it?
No, I don't think so.
It's about recognizing these fundamental patterns. Psychological phenomena that can appear, can interact in different contexts, maybe rarely with such devastating global results, thankfully, but the patterns themselves.
Exactly. It offers a perspective on how individual traits, maybe vulnerabilities, can intersect with really powerful social and historical circumstances and produce catastrophic results. Which brings us, I suppose, to the final pretty profound question that this source material leaves you with at the end. Given this specific mix of psychological factors it outlines, was Adolf Hitler truly unique, unrepeatable? Or could history, under different circumstances, maybe repeat itself?
That is certainly the question this deep dive leaves us chewing on, and it's one worth considering very deeply, I think.